Her occupation, she was a wife, she was a mother, and that's what she kind of struggled with, as we see, and a homemaker. Her family tree was husband Elkanah and children Samuel, with 3 other sons and 2 daughters. And we're going to see from this lesson on Hannah that she teaches us to never give up, Brother Jeff, to honor the promises we make to God, and to praise God for his wisdom and his kindness. So let's read about Hannah. Everyone please turn to 1 Samuel chapter 1. And over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be reading all 28 of these verses. So verse 1. Now there was a certain man of, who wants to attempt that? I don't know how to say that. So I'm just going to skip it. Of Mount Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeraham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zeph, and Ephraite. So here we see an introduction to Elkanah. He was a priest from this big old long word, whatever this town was called, but it's later referred to in the Bible as Ramah. And in this verse, we also see a lot of different references to the genealogy of Elkanah. And don't worry, Sister Samantha, we're not going to get into all of this genealogy stuff, because that's not what this lesson's about. But verse 2, and he had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. So Elkanah, he was a very rich man, very wealthy, very influential man, and he probably married Peninnah because Hannah was barren. And although many great Old Testament leaders such as Abraham, Jacob, and David had more than one wife, this was not God's original intention for marriage. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. So the marriage of 2 people became one flesh. So why did this practice, back in these old days, of having more than one wife, which is called polygamy, exist among God's people? Why was that? Well, in ancient Israel, children were a symbol of God's blessings. And people having numerous children was a sign of status and wealth. It was also a very important part of the society's economic structure. They were a source of labor for the family. And they were also an assurance of extending the man's family line or his heirs. It was also the duty of these children to be caretakers of their elderly or their widowed parents. Even in society where many young men were killed in battle, polygamy became an acceptable way of supporting women who would have otherwise remained unmarried and very likely become destitute. But nevertheless, with all these reasons for polygamy, it often caused serious family problems, especially with jealousy. And we're going to see that in this story of Hannah and Peninnah. Verse 3. And this man went up out of his city, yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priest of the Lord, were there. Now Shiloh was the religious center of Israel, and it was located about 20 miles north of Jerusalem. And all Israelite men were supposed to attend 3 annual feasts at this central sanctuary. It was the feast of the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, W-E-E-K-S, and the Feast of the Tabernacles. So old Elkanah, he always attended these festivals with his 2 wives. Now back to the term Lord of Hosts in this verse. That's a very important part of this verse. This is actually a military term that is mentioned over 260 times in the Old Testament. And it emphasizes that the Lord is the ultimate leader of Israel's armies. It underscores his sovereignty over all creations, whether earth or in heaven. Now Eli is also mentioned here. And for the first time in Israel, Eli was carrying out the functions of a high priest and a judge, judging Israel for 40 years. He was a very religious man whose service to the Lord was unblemished. However, he was a lax father who could not control his 2 sons, Phinehas and Hophni. So verse 4 and 5. And when the time was that Elkanah offered, he gave to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and her daughters portions. But unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb. So at this feast, Elkanah gave his wife, Peninnah, and to all of her sons and to all of her daughters, a portion or a part of the offering. But you got to realize that Hannah was the favorite wife of Elkanah, because the worthy portion is speaking of Hannah getting twice as much. This was to make up for her not being able to have children and the ridicule that she had to put up with because of that. Verse 6. And her adversary also provoked her sore, for to make her fret, because the Lord had shut up her womb. Now Hebrew women felt that they were cursed of God if they did not have children. And they were actually considered as a failure and as an embarrassment to their husbands. And Elkanah, he could have left Hannah if he'd have wanted to, because it was permitted to divorce a woman if she was barren. But he didn't. He remained lovingly devoted to this woman. Despite all his social criticism and everything, and even with his rights under civil law, he still didn't want to divorce her. Now, also as a wife, if you could not bear children, she was often obligated by ancient custom to give one of her servant girls to her husband to bear the children for her. And that is what we have to assume happened in this story. Now back to the part of the verse that says, and her adversary also provoked her sore, for to make her fret. So who's our adversary? The devil. right? And in this case, this devil was stirring up jealousy between these two wives. Hannah was jealous because of Peninnah's children, and Peninnah was jealous because Elkanah loved Hannah the most. Verse 7. And as he did so year by year, when she went up to the house of the Lord, so she provoked her. Therefore she wept and did not eat. So you have to think that this had been going on for years, and that this family being put together at these feasts every year just made it that much worse for Hannah. Mainly because it was a good opportunity for Peninnah to say ugly things to Hannah out in the public in front of everybody because she couldn't have children, which made Hannah so heartsick that she wept and she refused to eat. But part of God's plan for Hannah involved postponing her years of childbearing. So while Peninnah and Elkanah looked at Hannah's outward circumstances, God was moving ahead with his overall plan. Don't you wish sometime you knew what his overall plan was? It sure would help, wouldn't it? Verse 8. Then said Elkanah, her husband, to her, Hannah, why weepest thou? And why eatest thou not? And why is thy heart grieved? Am not I better to thee than 10 sons? Personal tragedy had so colored Hannah's perspective that she lost sight of the beauty and grace that was already in her life. Elkanah truly loved Hannah, and he was obviously upset because she was upset. And Hannah knew that her husband loved her, but even his encouragement was not enough to comfort her. She could not keep listening to Peninnah make fun of her and ruin her self-confidence. Just like with us, Gene, at this church or anywhere when we get out in the world, we cannot keep others from unjustly criticizing us, but we can choose on how we react to that criticism. What's our first reaction? To defend ourselves, or worse yet, to lash back at somebody. How many of you are guilty of that? Even though criticism can be hurtful and demoralizing, it can also be viewed as a positive. That's hard to imagine sometimes. It is honesty a lot of times, and it can spur us to be better people. It's an opportunity for us to improve. And by looking at it this way, we can get rid of that self-pity we have and replace it with hope. And that's what we need to do. Verse 9. So Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh, and after they had drunk. Now Eli the priest sat upon a seat by a post of the temple of the Lord. So the temple here is actually the tabernacle. And this verse does not mean that Hannah was drinking and eating. It is speaking of the rest of the family there, eating and drinking. Hannah is actually in the sanctuary, and Eli, the high priest, is in the tabernacle. And the post mentioned in this verse is speaking of the entrance to the holy place. And Eli was sitting on something like a throne, and all who was there for worship actually walked by him. Verse 10. And she was in bitterness of soul and prayed unto the Lord and wept sore. Now, the best place to go when one feels hopeless and bitter is before God. And all of us should start at the throne of God in prayer and turn whatever it is bothering us over to Him. Now, Hannah's heart was broken, and her prayer was very strong. She was crying, she had tears, she prayed intensely, and she wept bitterly. And she had a good reason to feel discouraged. She was unable to bear children. She shared her husband with a woman who ridiculed her. Her loving husband could not solve her problems. And we will see in the next verse that the high priest misunderstood her motives. But instead of retaliating and giving up hope, Hannah prayed. She brought her problem honestly before God. Now, we're all going to face times of discouragement, and we know how difficult it is to pray when we feel so down and out. Sometimes that's all we have, though, Brother Steve. Prayer opens the way up for God to work, just as Hannah is going to discover. Verse 11. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid, and remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, but will give unto thine handmaid a man-child, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life. And there shall no razor come upon his head. Vow. So Hannah was so desperate in wanting her prayer to be answered, she's willing to strike a bargain with God. And she pledged to give the Lord her son in return for God's favor in giving her a son. In other words, if God would grant her a son, she would set him apart for a special service to God. A promise that her son would be given to God for his purpose. And although some vows were temporary, Hannah's vow was for life. So just like Hannah, we had better be careful of what we promise in prayer. Even though we're not in a position to bargain with God, if you do this, God, I'll do this. God may choose to answer that prayer with that attached promise. So when you pray, Sister Kim, will I follow through on my promises I make to God if He answers my request? It's dishonest and dangerous to ignore a promise, especially to God. God keeps His promise to us, and He expects you to keep your promise to Him. Verse 12. And it came to pass as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli marked her mouth. So Hannah was praying. And Eli, he didn't see her lips moving in prayer, but when he touched her, he realized that they were moving. He realizes now that she is saying something under her breath. Verse 13. Now Hannah, who spake in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she had been drunken. Now public prayer in Israel was usually audible. People could hear you. However, Hannah was praying silently. And when Eli did not hear her words, he thinks the worst. He made a snap judgment before he knew all the facts. He assumes that she had too much to drink. Now for us, when we notice something is wrong with another person, what is our first reaction? We do the same thing. We make all these assumptions. Well, this person's doing this. We don't understand all the motives and the actions, but in our mind, we think we got it all figured out. But we got to be sensitive to other people because we have no idea what they're going through. And before we make a snap judgment, Sister Kathy, we better find out what's going on in their life. Because it can make it a whole lot worse if you got all these ideas and telling everybody it gets back to that person. Verse 14. And Eli said unto her, How long wilt thou be drunken? Put away thy wine from thee. Now, Eli, he may have observed her in the past, odd looks that she'd had and strange behavior in her. And he took that to think, well, she's got a drinking problem. Well, she's been drinking too much wine. And even though this was not the case, he tells her to break off this bad habit she's got. Go home, sleep it off, before she comes back to this place of worship. Verse 15. And Hannah answered and said, No, my Lord, I am a woman of a sorrowful spirit. I have drunk either wine nor strong drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. So Hannah, she quickly tells Eli, oh, you got this all wrong, brother. You're mistaken. I've not been drinking. I've been praying to God. And she did not intend for others to hear her request to God. And her heart is broken and drunk with affliction, not with wine. She's sad because she's been on and on asking for a child, and it has not happened. Verse 16. Count not thine handmaid for a daughter of Belial, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken hitherto. Now this term, daughter of Belial, here means a worthless or a wicked woman. And we see that Hannah associates women who are drunk with someone who is controlled by the devil. Well, I think it's a good stopping point this week, Brother Steve. We're going to pick back up next week and finish our lesson discussing verses 17 through 28. And we're going to summarize again what we can learn from Sister Hannah. So I appreciate your attention this morning. Ansel Sr., do you mind dismissing us in prayer?